wish I could live your life just for one day.
Surely at some point we've all imagined we were like someone else. It's natural to wish that we had the martial arts prowess of Bruce Lee or the razor-sharp wit of Oscar Wilde. And one of the great charms of video games is that they offer us a safe space to do that, to experience things that we can't in our day-to-day lives. But there's a fundamental difference between wishing we had the resourcefulness of Nathan Drake and wanting to become him. Video games occupy a strange space in that, unlike with films or literature, we don't just empathize with the characters in the fiction, but effectively become them for potentially hundreds of hours as we explore every nook and cranny and complete every little side quest that the game has to offer. Indeed, the relationship between the player and the character in the game is, to me, one of the most interesting things about video games. However, very few games discuss it, and those that do are often fiercely antagonistic, and sometimes outright condemn the player for simply playing the game. Fortunately, this isn't the only way to get the player to reflect on this relationship. Hotline Miami takes a less heavy-handed approach, presenting the player with vivid displays of brutality and saying nothing, opting instead to leave it up to the player to consider his actions and what motivated him. The subject of this video is an example of still another approach, one that's decidedly more positive. Since its release in 2005, Suda51's Killer 7 has been controversial to say the least. Its cryptic nature invites interpretation, and some readings can get pretty out there. There are those who see Killer 7 as a struggle between gods for world culture, and there are others who spin it as a labyrinthine socio-political commentary on the relationship between Japan and the United States after the Second World War. My reading, however, is much simpler. Killer 7 is about escapism, and although its message, that escapism is unhealthy, is nothing we haven't heard before, the way it conveys that message is worth discussing. Killer 7 isn't a game that asks,
"Do you feel like a hero yet?"
Nor does it spare you death and suffering. It simply shows a character utterly consumed by a fantasy. But what sets it apart from games that have trod similar ground is that it also shows the character regaining control. Which is why, despite its convoluted plot and dark, hard-edged aesthetic, Killer 7 might just be one of the most enlightening games I've ever played.
I think that's enough chit-chat. Shall we begin?
Even if you enjoy games that encourage the player to think a fair bit more than the average video game does, it's difficult to come away from a first playthrough of Killer 7 feeling anything other than profound confusion. We play as the enigmatic Killer 7, a group of professional assassins led by Harmon Smith, who take on the Heaven Smiles, a terrorist organization led by Kun Lan, because the Killer 7 are the only ones who can rid the world of terror. However, when the game begins, we're given very little information about what exactly is going on. We don't know where we are, what we're doing here, or who sent us. We're given an objective and expected to play it just like any other shooter, which is significant. By withholding things like plot and motivation at the start, we're left to just experience the gameplay, which is most similar to an arcade-style rail shooter when you look at the gallery shooting, but it's designed to really get in your head. Snapping to a smile's weak point and blasting it rewards the player with not only a satisfying shower of particles, but also the character's smarmy catchphrase.
This is too easy.
Never gets old. But rail shooter is only part of it. It's a bit different from something like Time Crisis in that you're not simply propelled to the next area to shoot more things. You need to explore the levels as well, and solve occasional puzzles, which are both rather unique in what's ostensibly a shooter. But while the mechanics can be baffling at first, they're nothing compared to the narrative, which is almost playful with how it draws attention to the fact that it's a shooter, and that you shouldn't concern yourself with the finer details of the narrative. For example, one of the first characters you meet tells you, Harmon's room is to the right, the bloodbath straight ahead. The keys to the puzzles, the odd engravings, aren't diegetically contextualized, they're simply called odd engravings. After all, as another character points out, what does it matter to you what they are? You're just a killer. The game gets around to addressing its plot one mission in, where the setup for the game is delivered in a sleep-inducing 4.5-minute long cutscene that doesn't really explain a whole lot at all, and things only get murkier from there. Your targets throughout the game don't seem to be connected in any way. You target the leader of a terrorist organization, a Japanese political leader, a crazy guy in Texas, a human trafficker, a comic book artist, and a Super Sentai group. In any other game that starred several characters, it would introduce and give a little backstory on each one so we could get to know them. Killer 7 does this for one of its characters, 2 if you count Garcian, before abandoning the idea altogether. Not to mention, of course, the miscellaneous chicanery, like the shifting animation styles from level to level and the sometimes odd musical dissonance. But all this wackiness is done for a reason. Like most Suda51 games, Killer 7 insists that the player not be immersed in the story, but remain distanced enough to engage with the ideas it presents and think critically about them. So, while on the surface Killer 7 is a perplexing tale that deals with assassins, terrorism, political maneuvering, multiple personalities, SMG-toting Kigurumi girls, and ghosts, or something, beneath it all, Killer 7 is a game about consider our protagonist, Garcian Smith, and let's be clear, he isn't a badass assassin the likes of some of the other Smiths.
I went to see the devil. Now it's your turn.
In fact, the game explicitly says that Garcian never kills people himself. His role is only to recover the bodies. Not to mention, of course, that he's not really a combat character, Garcian. He can't be upgraded, gets no skills, his gun is effectively useless, he's unwieldy to use because he's so much taller than the other characters, and of course if Garcian dies, it's game over. More often than not, it's frustrating to play as Garcian. In short, our main character is very much out of place in a game ostensibly about being an assassin. However, Garcian does have another, much more important role in the Killer 7 though, which is to manage the other personalities. If you were to compare it to, say, a video game, Garcian has much the same role as the player. He's the one facilitating things back at base, controlling the characters in the game, choosing who goes out into the field, whose skills are improved, and so on. I also don't think it's a coincidence that the medium through which Garcian manages the personalities is a television. It's a lot like what we're doing as we sit on the couch and play the game. Consider as well that shortly after arriving at a mission he changes into another person. This is weird, certainly, but the nearly immediate replacement of our protagonist with another, much more compelling character is worth mentioning, because it's exactly what we do when we play a video game. We take on the roles of characters who are often much more interesting than ourselves. And the silliness of Garcian's, and by extension the players, acting only through these personas is emphasized by Ayame Blackburn, whom we first see before Encounter, where she's just a normal girl and is absolutely terrified of Curtis. The next time we see her though, she's donned a mask and imagines herself as a character in some magical girl anime. It should seem absurd to the player, but that's only because we're on the outside looking in, and don't yet recognize that Garcian, and we the player, are doing the exact same thing. But again, what really makes Killer 7 remarkable is that it doesn't dwell on this escapist angle. While the idea that Garcian exists on some level as an analog for the player is important, the point of the game isn't to show that players use video games as a means to live out escapist fantasies. Rather, we spend most of Killer 7 following Garcian as he tries to make sense of what's going on around him. And the way he goes about that is very similar to the way those who practice Buddhism achieve enlightenment. According to practitioners, to awaken to the true nature of things, one must simply let go of the various things in life that cause suffering, which happens to Garcian throughout the game. We watch as those who construct Garcian's identity and give him purpose, Harmon and Mills, disappear or are killed, eliminating those exterior influences and the holds they had over him, which is then followed by the deaths of his personalities, silencing his inner voices and the turmoil there. In the penultimate chapter, Garcian finally acknowledges and embraces his traumatic past as a mirror, ridding himself of fears and uncertainties, which leads to the final section of the game, where we ostensibly play as Garcian, but very clearly not the Garcian we knew anymore. Rather, I would argue, an awakened Garcian, emphasized by not only his appearance, but his potency in combat. Where earlier gameplay segments with Garcian were clunky and awkward, it's now effortless, similar to the way Buddhists describe life after achieving enlightenment. It's also difficult to ignore the numerous other Buddhist parallels in the game. You have Garcian's prominent yellow tie representing rebirth, the 7 factors of enlightenment and the 7 universal mental constituents present in both the number of characters and chapters, each more or less representing one of the 7. You have the game's focus on cycles reminiscent of the concept of samsara, illustrated in the overarching struggle between Harmon and Kunlun, recurring characters and areas, and even in minor things like the fact that the rings aren't obtained, but returned. One of the primary visual metaphors in Buddhism is that of eyes, which serve to remind followers to remain vigilant with their practice, and eyes appear absolutely everywhere in Killer 7. Characters reference eyes several times throughout the game.
Use your eyes to decipher how the system works.
The character intro cuts always focus on the eyes. The health meter is an eye. Garcian's vision ring enables him to see the smiles, and Garcian's third eye, which indicates that the bearer has achieved enlightenment, plays a rather large part in the 6th chapter. In the same vein, you have the changing shades of the moon before each level, representing Garcian's clouded understanding. This is why, in Smile, as we're getting closer to the truth, the moon appears its natural color, but still a bit hazy, as if run through a black and white filter. Whereas in Lion, the moon is completely clear. All of this suggests to me that Killer 7 is ultimately about reaching a state of awareness or clarity, and in a clever metafictive nod, the way Garcian does this is by playing a game. A lot of people who have analyzed this game say that the chess games Harmon and Kunlun play represent East and West, or Japan and the US, or something similar. But the thing is that the chess never reflects what's going on in Killer 7, such as the assassination of political leaders or even the destruction of Japan, which seems like a fairly decisive move if we're talking about Japan and the US. Instead, I would argue that what Harmon and Kunlun play for is Garcian, and which of the two will ultimately decide his fate. Will Garcian plug along in his fantasy world constructed by Harmon, or will an eccentric Asian man set him free? With all of these ideas present and recurring enough that I don't think they can be ignored, I think it's clear that Killer 7 is out to do more than simply reproach the player for indulging in a fantasy. What's important is our ability to see beyond the fantasy.
To finish this game peacefully is my last wish.
Although the player is only given a single real choice in Killer 7, that one choice carries more weight than any of those in Skyrim or Mass Effect or many other games that tout player choice as something worth touting because of the way the game has built up to and framed that choice. The player is given very little freedom in Killer 7. When it comes to exploration, the player is limited to micro choices like whether to go to the hallway or the garden, and whole sections of the game are entirely scripted, only requiring the player to aim and fire to advance the story. And this lack of freedom isn't limited to just the mechanics. It extends into the narrative as well. The first half of Sunset gives the player the illusion of choice. Travis asks you multiple times where your loyalties lie, which side you're on when it comes to Japan and the US, and what you're going to do about it. But ultimately you have no choice in the matter. Fukushima is assassinated regardless of who you sympathize with. The player is just along for the ride. But this isn't the case for the entire game. At the very end of the game, the player is given a choice, and it's a very interesting one because you don't know what the game expects of you. There is no clear good or bad choice and no Paragon Renegade system to game. The sudden option is a surprise, not to mention that the setup for this choice happened 6 levels ago and so much has happened since then. But again, this is of course intentional, because with Garcian's story now wrapped up, all that's left is the player. You'll recall that I argue Garcian achieves his enlightened state by letting go of things that cause suffering, and I would argue that we, the player, are now in a very similar situation. We're divorced from the pesky roles we had to play and objectives to follow. The only character we could relate to on some level is now a complete enigma, and our objective in this final mission isn't even a proper objective. And it's in this bewildering moment, where player and character are truly divorced from one another, that I feel the game's core message really comes through. By the simple gesture of giving us this choice, the game puts us at that same pivotal moment where Garcian decided for himself to return to the Union Hotel. It places us on the path to reaching that state of mindfulness and awareness, not about ourselves, but about what games can do for us. Whether we use video games as an escape from negativity, to simply take a break from the stressors of life, to access the range of experiences of talented game developers, or to explore our own imaginations, the game itself can only do so much. What matters is what we choose to do with those experiences. Ultimately, Killer 7 wants you to reflect on the rules video games place on us and realize that we're held back by them. After all, what Killer 7 leaves you with is perhaps intentionally unsatisfying. Both choices end in even more bloodshed, and the struggle between Harmon and Kunlun isn't resolved at all. But at the same time, we wouldn't have gotten anywhere if it weren't for the game. Killer 7 doesn't want you to quit playing video games the way some lesser games seem to suggest. It wants you to strike a balance. What I respect most about Killer 7 is that it's a game that respects the player. Games rarely aspire to be surreal and self-conscious the way Killer 7 is. Games don't respect the player enough to confuse or frustrate them, or trust them enough to mine meaning from an obtuse narrative, abstract imagery, and a strange set of mechanics. Killer 7 does all of this while at the same time managing to, well, have fun. Let's not forget the scene in which Mask headbutts a bullet, or the entire Handsome Men arc, or most of the side characters. Killer 7 is a shining example of the fact that games don't need to compromise a message for fun, or fun for a message. It's all about balance. Killer 7 strikes that balance as an old-school rail shooter that develops into a profound journey that shows the player reaching their true potential through a video game. It ought to make you want more from the medium, because games can be so much more than simple entertainment. They can help us understand complex ideas and systems, help us cope with difficult situations, and to ultimately better understand each other. But what Killer 7 shows us is that they can only help. It's up to the player to do something about it. Whether it's addressing the negative feelings that drove you to escapism, or to try your hand at making a video game of your own. Because, to quote the final line of Killer 7, the world won't change. All it does is turn. More videos are coming as I finish them, so if you like what you've seen, stay tuned. But until then, Samantha, the lights.
Of course, sir.
Have you heard? Critics are calling On the Rise and Fall of Fire Emblem the best Fire Emblem analysis of its kind. Opened my mind on video games in general, and a lot of weird opinions in this series. Check it out today